We are recording this session as well, so others who come in maybe a couple minutes late are still able to hear what they missed. So I'll just say firstly, welcome to everyone who is here. We're really excited to be putting on this joint presentation between the Office of Career Strategy and then also the Fellowships Office. So I will let all of our panelists introduce themselves, but I'll start with myself. My name is Holly. I am a third-year PhD candidate in environmental engineering. So I'm the STEM advisor for the Office of Career Strategy. So if you're interested in going to graduate school and have some questions or just don't even know where to begin, I'm happy to meet with you individually. And I will let Emily introduce herself next.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Emily. I am a seventh year PhD candidate in the history department. I am the Humanities and Social Sciences peer advisor with the Office of Career Strategy. And yeah, I talk to students about all kinds of majors throughout the humanities and social sciences and about applying to grad school. So thanks for joining us today.
And then lastly, so we usually do this presentation, Emily and I tag team this presentation, and we are lucky enough to be graced by Lindsay. So I will let Lindsay introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Lawton. I'm the Senior Associate Director in the Fellowships Office. So I send a lot of students to talk with Holly and Emily about their hopes and dreams for graduate school, but I also work with students who are pursuing competitive fellowships, both at Yale and external awards. I work especially with Fulbright, so you'll hear more about that later on. I have a real soft spot in my heart for Fulbright programs, but our office supports students who are pursuing any kind of competitive award for graduate school or for other things. So today we're going to focus a lot on those fellowships, the funding sources that can help pay for graduate study.
And I think another thing that I'll just underscore is we're going to talk about the whole process of applying to graduate school, all the different components to it, and then also some of the fellowships. And I just want to highlight that a lot of what you will have to do for a graduate school application can also help to shape a fellowship application as well. So thinking about recommendation letters, thinking about personal statements, these kinds of things, it's almost like two birds, one stone, where you have to do obviously some work for each of them. But if you're thinking about applying to graduate school, it never hurts to also think about applying for fellowship. So we'll talk about that as well. So first slide, Emily. So the first question that we always like to start this presentation with is why graduate school? So if you're here, hopefully you've been asking yourself this question many, many times, and continue to ask yourself this question as you're going through the graduate school process. So some specific questions to ask yourself is, why are you considering going to graduate school? This question is one that I asked myself in the middle of my senior year, and I didn't have a good answer to it. So I realized that graduate school is not the right option for me. And I'm really glad that I ended up taking, and this is the question at the bottom of this, taking some time off to figure out the answer to this question. Why am I going to graduate school? What do I want to do with my degree? And how can what I want to do with my degree, does that fall into perhaps a master's category or a PhD? Do I want to do something research-based? Do I want to get more skills or content in a particular field? Do I have a career in mind that I know that I need to have a master's degree for? These kinds of things, starting to look a little bit into the future about what you want to do with your degree. And then what topics are you truly excited about? So especially when you're thinking about a PhD, which can be 5, 6, 7, 8 years, if you're thinking about doing a research PhD, what topics really kind of get you excited and get you going? And what I like to say is graduate school is a lot of this and what's going to get you through the peaks and the valleys of that. And then, as I said, do I want to take time off? This is definitely a personal question. And as I spoke a little bit about myself, I needed a year away from undergrad to really sit down and think about, what do I want to do? Why do I want to go to graduate school? I was a chemistry and physics major in undergrad and realized that chemistry graduate school wasn't something that was really exciting to me. So I needed to take a step back and say, okay, let me reevaluate what is it about science and about research that I'm really excited about. And that's how I landed upon environmental engineering, which I'm in now. So just to say that taking time off is an absolutely very common thing for people to do, both to do things that can bolster your resume, like doing some research at an NIH funded center, et cetera, et cetera. But for my case, I took a year off and taught middle school, which was just a really fun break away from being in the academy. I got to hang out with some 12-year-olds. So it also doesn't necessarily have to be a classically research productive year either. So just wanted to caveat that. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about, what presentation would we have in 2021 without having a small side note about the COVID-19 consideration. And so one thing that we just like to mention with COVID-19 is that you're seeing a lot of people that I've talked to have been thinking about going to graduate school because they view it as their safety option, the market being really uncertain, not knowing whether you're going to get a job after graduate school. And I would just, of course, caution against just diving straight into graduate school as just because you're kind of uncertain or wary about what getting a job might be like. Because again, you really want to be asking yourself these questions of what do you want to get out of graduate school and what perhaps research you want to do, those kinds of questions. And then the second caveat here is that there is competitiveness and reduced funding of programs as a result of COVID-19, because a lot of researchers who were planning, for example, like anthropologists who need to go out into the field, sixth-year anthropologists weren't able to travel last year. So a lot of people are extending their time for their current PhD students. And so if you have people who are sixth, seventh years now becoming eighth and ninth years, there's just some less funding for incoming classes to kind of equilibrate or balance that out. So this is definitely program specific and also school specific as well, but just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about applying to graduate school. And next slide, please.
Sorry.
And then the next question that we often get as advisors is, how many programs should I be applying to? How do I find them? Should I have a safety school? What is a reach school? How do I know where I fall in? And these are all really good questions, but those are, I would say, more applicable for thinking about applying to undergraduate schools as opposed to graduate schools. So in the question of how many programs, it usually depends based on, of course, like what field you're in, what you're interested in, how broad for PhD, for example, how broad your research topic is, but usually it's between 4 and 8. Very rarely are there people applying to upwards of 15, 20 schools, which I know is more common for like a med school application. For graduate school, it's usually on you're able to count it on 2 hands kind of a thing. And of course, we have in parentheses here, considering financial implications, because a lot of schools have an application fee associated. So in order to submit your application, you have to submit a fee, and these can range from $50 to $150. So if you're thinking about applying to 10 different schools, there are fee waivers that you can apply for, but that's a separate kind of part of the process. So if you don't apply for those fee waivers or you aren't approved for those fee waivers and you're applying to 10 schools, that can easily be $1,000. So just putting that also in the back of your mind to consider as you're thinking about schools. You shouldn't be necessarily limited by financial status. And as I said, there are, of course, fee waivers that you can apply for, but that's something that you also need to, unfortunately, a lot of schools don't make that totally apparent on their website. So you kind of have to do some digging for yourself to find those fee waivers. So to start your list of these 4 to 8 programs, our number one piece of advice is to leverage your network of incredible people at Yale and beyond. So talk to current graduate students. If you're doing research in a lab right now, or you're working on your senior thesis, go and talk to current graduate students. If you can't tell from how much I love talking about this, we are very open and able to talk to you about what our process was like. And that oftentimes I think is the best way to get a sense of what your particular field is. Also talk to past professors, go to office hours, send an email, talk to the people that are here that are doing research or in a field that you potentially could see yourself pursuing. Again, whether for a master's or a PhD, they might have some insight and advice as to what programs to look at. Another place to potentially look is the US News and World Report will rank graduate programs. And I believe that the rankings for graduate programs just came out maybe in the past 2 weeks or so. So this is a place to go if you just want to kind of get a really cursory glance over what programs are there. And of course, taking their rankings with a grain of salt, because it's not always apparently clear how they rank these programs. So just using that as a list to then go and do your own research, go to their program websites, talk to faculty, grad students about these particular programs. That could be a good kind of springboard from which to start. And then as you're starting your list, start thinking really critically about what your deal breakers are. Things like location, research topic, what course requirements you might have, what internship or requirements or opportunities that school might have. So think about what your deal breakers are and be really honest with yourself as you're evaluating the list. Even if the #1 program is in Berkeley, California, but your whole family is in upstate New York and you can't bear to be away from them, that's a really important personal consideration to have, because graduate school, as I said, does a lot of this. So you want to make sure that you're going to be in a place that you could see yourself being for a couple of years and be happy about it. The next, as you've kind of gathered your first couple of programs, to evaluate your list, explore the program and faculty websites and start thinking about what really gets you excited, whether it's research. And for that, maybe go to Google Scholar or JSTOR to review publications of the faculty that are on these websites. And start reading abstracts of their most recent work. If you're applying to a master's program, what's the focus of the program? If you're interested in particularly in doing online education and you want to get master's in education specifically so that you can teach in a virtual setting like this, of course, making sure that the program has the specialty that you're really interested in will be important. But I think it's also important to look and see what courses are both required and then available. Because even if you have a specialization in a particular field for a master's program, what other places can you potentially explore? And then are there specialties? So just in evaluating the list, I guess our main advice is really to go to program websites and start clicking around on the different both faculty that are available and then the courses that are available for your program as well. And then the next question and the big question of this presentation, I kind of went quickly through these past 2 slides because this is where we really want to focus this presentation, which is the question of funding. And I caveat this by, in the US at least, some of these are applicable in the US, but I do know that some PhD and master's programs in the US are slightly different. And I also know that, of course, as Lindsay's going to talk about for fellowships, this will also be slightly different. So this is if you are just applying to a PhD or a master's program here in the US, and you are not using this fellowship to apply for it, that will be the next topic of our conversation. But the question of funding, even though I just laid out all of these caveats, is even more complicated just in the US because it's different between PhD and master's programs. For PhD programs, it's generally program and school specific, but for the most part, you are not paying to attend. So this means that your tuition at that university, a small stipend, not anything that you're going to be living in a penthouse suite in New York City, but enough that you'll be able to get groceries, pay for your rent, et cetera. And then your healthcare are generally covered in your PhD program. And then, of course, thinking about what, in addition to kind of these baseline needs, and then as well your baseline stipend salary, thinking about if you have childcare considerations, whether the university provides extra funding, which I know that Yale does, provides extra funding for children, whether there are on-campus requirements or options to boost your stipend or to support your stipend. For example, TFing at some universities is mandatory for X number of semesters. as a contingency for getting your stipend. And then after you meet X requirement beyond that, you get paid for that TFing. But then, as we will talk about, applying for fellowships, never, never, never a bad idea. And then thinking about the master's program, unlike the PhD, it's very difficult, but not impossible to get a fully funded program or even partially funded program. For the most part, most master's programs will require that you are paying tuition and they will not give you a stipend. So that means that you are also paying for your own living expenses. However, you can look on program websites for partial scholarship options. And I am now going to, again, take the opportunity to thank Lindsay for coming in today, because applying for fellowships will be your best friend in thinking about applying for master's programs that can be fully funded. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay, who's going to talk a little bit about the fellowships process.
Thanks, Holly. Emily, can you click over to the next slide, please? So one of the things that I want to start with in the conversation about fellowships is that there are hundreds of different fellowships for all of the different things. There are more fellowships in the world than we can keep in our brains or in our databases. And so when you come to meet with us, what is helpful is if you say, here's the thing that I'm interested in, either the experience I'm interested in having, or the discipline I'm interested in studying, or ideally both of those things, so that we can look together and see where can we dig up the funding to support research on wolves in Austria, or where can we dig up the funding to support photography in Iceland. There are so many fellowships out there that we want to try to find, and I'm going to gesture as if you're here with me looking at the screen, that you want to find the intersection or the overlap between the fellowships that are out there in the world and what you're interested in, what you are going to be able to use to work toward your goals, and then the graduate programs, right? There are fellowships that would be a great fit for your interests, but cannot pay for graduate study. So if you're looking specifically for grad funding, that's not helpful. There are fellowships that are out there for graduate programs, but they don't work with your particular interests, goals, or qualifications. So then those are also going to be a waste of your time. And our office is here to help you figure out how to best use the time and energy that you have to figure out what to apply for when there are hundreds of things out there that you could be looking at. So where to start? Always, always, always your specific goals and interests. So the more clear you can be about that, the more helpful it is to you and to our office. What I mean by that is not, my goal is to get a graduate degree from Harvard, but rather, I'm really interested in answering these kinds of questions, or I'm pursuing a career in this particular area of this particular field. Those kinds of specific goals and interests can be really helpful in the fellowship search. If you come to our office and say, I'm really interested in fellowships, I'll do whatever, it's gonna be really hard to figure out what's gonna be the best fit for you. We'll talk about Fulbright though. So some awards are tied to specific degree programs. And on the slide, the example I give is the Schwarzman Scholarship. It's a ton of money and it's a great award if what you want to do is get a master's degree at Tsinghua University in China in international affairs. Now, if you want to go to China to study something like literature, the Schwarzman is not going to be a good fit for you. If you want to do international affairs, but you want to do it in the US, Schwarzman is no good for you. So that's where you want to have your own personal Venn diagram. Some fellowships are restricted to certain institutions. You can only use them at a particular school. So you may be applying to 8 different grad programs, but this Fulbright will only support a master's degree at this particular institution. So you can apply for a Fulbright to support the master's program at LSE, but you're not going to be able to take that with you to UCL instead. The Knight-Hennessy is a good example of this. It's a great option. It will cover your whole graduate degree at Stanford. It's anything you want, but it has to be at Stanford. So you can't take that if you went into Harvard Law. You couldn't take the Knight-Hennessy to Harvard. Many national fellowships, though, are restricted to a group of institutions or areas of study. So the Pickering is an example of one that's for a graduate degree leading to a career in international affairs. So that might be a master's of public policy. You could make the case, although it would be a hard one, that maybe you need a master's in public health. Now is a good time to make that particular case. But there's like a range of master's programs that you could pursue leading to that career in international affairs. Pickering only works for those particular kinds of degrees. You cannot use the Pickering to get a master's in education or a master's in English literature. So this is just like the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to fellowship stuff. Figure out your specific goals and interests. And also, if you can, figure out your timeline. That will help you figure out not just what to apply for, but what to apply for at which point in your journey. All fellowship applications should be started sooner than you think. You might be thinking, oh, I'm a junior, I've got lots of time. Now's the time, juniors. Get to our office. Get on our Zoom offices, because spring of junior year, especially if you're thinking of going directly to graduate school after you finish your bachelor's degree, spring of junior year is a great time to get started thinking about Fulbright, thinking about Rhodes, Marshall, Mitchell, those UK awards. Some of these competitions have deadlines in August. So you want to start now. Maybe you're a sophomore, maybe you're a first year and you're already thinking about this, which is fantastic. Well done. It's still good to start thinking about what is the thing that I'm going to do after graduate school and reverse engineer to what grad program you need to be doing. And then reverse engineer from that to what fellowships might be a good option. Fall of junior year, if there are any sophomores in the room, fall of junior year, there are deadlines for things like the Truman Scholarship, which is funding for graduate study. It can help support a law degree, which is very popular. But you apply in November of junior year. So always earlier than you think. As soon as you have these ideas about grad programs and your specific interests, come and see us so that we can help you figure out what your timeline is. In your timeline, you also want to build in that time between your bachelor's and graduate study. If you want to do a year traveling the world, which someday will be a possibility again, think about that timeline, because it's also the case that fellowships, some of them you have to be enrolled to apply, but some of them you don't. Fulbright, for example, you can apply for until you complete your terminal degree. You don't need to be a student at Yale to apply for a Fulbright. And you can even get advice from our office if you've been a student at Yale. If there are non-Yaleys on this call, sorry, I can't help you. So start sooner than you think you're going to need to. And generally speaking, this is a gross generalization, but about a year before you would want to begin the experience, you want to be ready to apply for funding, give or take. It will also be helpful for you to note that there are often separate applications. So Schwartzman is an example where you apply just once and like, that's it. But for Fulbright, you apply to the graduate program and you apply separately for the grant. So you want to stay really organized. I recommend a spreadsheet. I've seen students with like a butcher paper chart on the wall where they've got everything color coded or like sticky notes, but you need a way to keep track of which things require which components by which deadline. Because they'll all be similar enough to be confusing, but different enough that it's going to ruin your plans if you miss one. The other thing that I just want to note, because I've mentioned some competitions that I think have a reputation, like Truman or Rhodes, I hear from a lot of students that they assume they weren't qualified. I worked with one fantastic student who started our conversation with, somebody told me I should talk to you about Fulbright, but that's for people who are smart and have their act together. Do not count yourself out. We'll count you out. If we think you're not qualified, we think you're not a good fit for the fellowship, we will be pretty frank with you about that. There are some requirements. Many of the awards that we work on, unfortunately, are restricted to US citizens. There are some resources for international students as well, though, and we have a list of fellowships that are open to DACA students. So don't assume that there's nothing for you. Come and talk with us so that we can figure out together what is and is not a possibility for you. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Emily. Yeah.
Thanks, Lindsay. Okay, so now we're going to move into some other components of what applying to grad school requires. And perhaps one of the most important components is the personal statement, like we highlight here. So the logistics behind the personal statement, it's going to usually be about 1 to 1.5 pages, single spaced. And this is really your, excuse me, your option to present who you are, what you want to study, and why. And we'll get to sort of like how you do that in the next slide. But just the basics, you should really start thinking about this the spring and the summer before you start applying. And we're not really going to talk about timeline today, but generally most deadlines are at the end of the calendar year. So usually in like December, sometimes January, sometimes November. So you really want to start thinking about how you're going to complete all of these components sooner rather than later. This is also something that I will co-sign what Lindsay's saying, is that these things just take so much longer than you expect. And this is absolutely true for writing a personal statement. Even though it's short, it is mighty, and it's something that you really want to get right. So you can use this to address any questionable aspects of your application, but only, like we say, only if you can demonstrate extraordinary circumstances and or growth. You can use faculty recommendations to address some of these shortcomings if you want to, or if you feel like you need to. I will also say that there, in many applications, there's also a space where you can have an additional statement. If you want to talk about why your GPA might be lower, why you had a hard time adjusting to college, your first year, family issues, stuff like that. Usually I would recommend saving that for the extra statement. But the personal statement can definitely be a place where you talk about these challenges that you've overcome in your undergraduate career. And yes, just a side note that this is different from, but related to, your fellowship statement. As Holly said in the beginning, these things both require many statements, and usually the reason why you're going to be demonstrating the need for funding is a little different than why you're applying to a specific program. So just getting into, if my slides will ever change, getting into the meat of it, the content. Okay, so now we get to it. I don't know why they're freezing. Sorry, guys. The content behind the personal statement, you should be asking several key questions. Why do you want to go to graduate school? Why this field? What have you done to prepare for this program? You should talk about your research experience, your internships, your classes, your clubs. And then what research questions really excite you? What skills or content, are you hoping to gain from this program? Again, this is going to look different, your personal statement, between the PhD and an MA, because a PhD, you're going to want to float your dissertation project or your research project, and have a really pointed but general idea of what you want to study in the PhD. Whereas in an MA personal statement, you're going to want to demonstrate why this degree and what kind of career you want after, and how this program is going to help you achieve that career, whether that's in international relations, whether that's as a diplomat, whether that's as a public health person. Usually when I read MA statements, when I talk to students about their MA statements, this is the area that they struggle in the most, is communicating what they want to do after the MA program, and how the MA program is going to help them get to that career that they want. So that's something super important that you should demonstrate if you're writing an MA personal statement versus the PhD. But in both cases, you're going to want to talk about, have a school specific paragraph as to why this particular program. What courses are you excited about taking? How does this apply to your research interests? And particularly, what faculty members are you going to work with, and how do their interests align with yours, and vice versa? So the process of applying to graduate school is kind of this like two-way match situation, where you want to match with the school, but you also want to show the school that they match with you. And so this means showing that they have the faculty members who can advise you. If you're applying for a PhD, more than one person is going to be on your dissertation committee. And so you want more than one person in this department to take interest in your research questions, your research project, and whatnot. So one helpful way to think of this, this really interesting, challenging statement is like it's an intellectual biography. It's who you are, where you're coming from, where you want to go, and what you want to study. So it's an intellectual biography, a cover letter, and an argument-driven narrative about research compatibility, all rolled into like 700 words. It's challenging to write this, and I will reiterate that I worked this past year with many students who are writing statements, because you need people to read them, and you need to get as many eyes as possible on these statements. And that can be us here in the office. It can also be current grad students in the programs that you're interested in. It can also be former TAs, and especially it can be your advisors here at Yale, because they know the field. They know you, and they can help you tailor the statement accordingly. Okay, so then we move into—
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, Holly, go for it.
Can I potentially put Lindsay on the spot a little bit and just talk about how a fellowship personal statement might be similar and or different to a grad school personal statement? I feel like this is a good point to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is, please do not just copy the whole thing from one application to the other. It will go badly for you. Part of the reason for that is that graduate programs are looking for particular things in admitted students, maybe a particular research agenda that fit with faculty, right? Fellowships are looking for particular things that may not be exactly the same. With a fellowship, just like with a graduate program, you want to do your research and understand what are the things that they are looking for. Sometimes a fellowship really is focused on the content of what you're going to do. What is your research about? Why is it relevant and important? Sometimes fellowships are more about who you are and your particular character, your contributions as a future public servant, and about kind of what you're going to go on to do after graduate school. They'll pay for grad school to help you get there, but they care more about who you are than your grad program will. I guess they'll care about who you are too, but in a different way, more to do with your research. So all of that is just to say, make sure that you understand the differences between what the grad program might be looking for and what the fellowship is meant to do. What the fellowship is meant to support should be reflected in your statement. I know we're going to talk about recommendations later on, but it's a similar thing with your recommenders. You can use the same people sometimes, but it's not always going to be the best idea to do that. So just be thinking about, how are these things different? How is the grad program prioritizing this or that? How is the fellowship really looking for this information? Is that helpful?
Yeah,
that's what you were looking for, Holly?
Yep, thanks.
Great.
Yeah, and there are just so many different nuances to the personal statement, and you're going to have a different personal statement for each program and each university that you apply to. And so it's hard to sort of generalize about what they need to do, because even I've seen many, especially for MA programs, they'll tell you exactly what they want you to address, or like the different categories of things that you need to hit. And they're going to be very different than writing a fellowship application. And there'll
be different lengths, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the graduate school personal statement is going to be one thing. And for one fellowship, you might have 800 characters.
Wow.
So those are going to be really different writing projects.
Yeah. So just take our advice and start sketching out what kind of requirements each component requires way ahead of time. And so, okay, if I can get my slide to change again, maybe. Anyway, I know that the next slide is going to talk about test scores. Do my test scores matter? And we say yes, but probably not as much as you think. So especially now with COVID, COVID is changing things in the testing world, which in my opinion is great. Um, we'll see if it sticks, and these departments that are eliminating the GRE as a requirement, if they continue to do that. So even though they are phasing it out, and some of the programs you're applying to might not require the GRE, typically between the 7 programs that you're applying to, one of them will. And so you're going to want to take it. Again, because of COVID, you might want to take it sooner rather than later, because instead of going to a GRE testing center, which is probably one of the most depressing places on the face of the planet, speaking from experience, you can take it at home, which seems so much better. And your scores last for 5 years. So even if you are going to take a break, like Holly so wisely recommends, you can go ahead and do that now or this summer, and like if you're a senior, and like save the scores for 5 years, and just get it out of the way. And so how we recommend preparing to take the GRE is just typically like buy a study book, study, you know, those Princeton, the Kaplan ones, buy 1, buy 2, study for a month or 2, and then go ahead and take it. Generally, we find this is sufficient for most students, because you want to do well, but you don't have to like strive to, you know, to do the ultimate best on the GRE, because this is just one like factor in the broader scheme of components. And I will say that different people have different attitudes as to how the GRE factors into your application. Like some professors are going to be like, oh, the GRE matters a lot, and other professors are going to be like, I could literally care less. So it's a formality. Do it, get it done, it'll be fine.
And kind of to emphasize what Lindsay was saying earlier about not counting yourself out, I've had so many conversations with people who are like, I only got X score on my GRE. Does that mean I shouldn't apply to all of these places? And the answer to that is no, don't count yourself out. Talk to any of us about thinking about programs, but as Emily said, and as she will say for GPA as well, don't limit yourself on where you're applying just based on these numeric metrics, because there's so much that goes into a grad school application.
Yeah, and in the wise words of academic Twitter, you know, I just see post after post about professors who, like famous professors now, who like had low GPAs as an undergrad and then went on to be this like extremely successful scholar. So grades are only so reflective of your potential, and we know that. So don't count yourself out. I will also say that after teaching and TAing for many, many years here at Yale, the undergrads typically have a skewed vision of what a good GPA is and what a bad GPA is. And I say this as somebody who comes from like a giant public university where like a 3.0 is like amazing. And now I talk to students here at Yale who are like, I have a 3.0, like, can I go to grad school? And I'm like, well, absolutely, like you should apply. And you know, and anyways, this is part of a broader conversation about perception and grades. But the moral of the story is don't count yourself out. You know, getting into a grad program is so much more than about your GPA. It's about, you know, it's about research skills. It's about who you know. It's about your research. It's about the fit, your fit with the program. And so having a transcript, you know, can convey what classes you've taken if you're prepared to do graduate coursework. I think this can be really important, especially, I don't know, Holly might say a word about this, about more mathematically and science-based courses who want prerequisites for higher education, or just to demonstrate that you have interest in this particular area. I'm not sure if this is like true for all fields, but it might be true for some fields. And transitioning fields is also really common. I know that Holly will say more about transitioning because she transitioned fields from undergrad to grad, but I talk to students all the time who studied anthropology as an undergrad, but now want to go to grad school for political science or something like that. And they're like, can I do this? Can I learn something new in grad school? And I'm like, yes, the point of going to grad school is to learn more and to become like an expert in the field, because you don't arrive to grad school being an expert. And transitioning fields is really common, but you just want to, going back to the personal statement, really explain why you're switching fields, what this new field is what you can bring to this new field, and why your research aligns in this new direction. So yes, Holly, I didn't know if you wanted to add a couple points on these.
Not particularly, just that, yes, switching fields also demonstrate that you've really asked yourself this question of why graduate school, which is the most important question. And if you are like me, who is in undergrad, like kind of on the hamster wheel of like, I guess I'm a chemistry major, I guess I'm going to grad school for chemistry. And it wasn't until I like stopped and stepped off the hamster wheel that I was like, oh wait, I don't actually want this. I think that is really revelatory and will come across in your personal statement and your application as a whole of like, oh, you really thought about this. Like, it's not just, I'm going to keep going on this path of least resistance. You're actually wanting to pursue this particular field and you've thought a lot about it. So just highlighting, underlining everything Emily said.
I'd also just like to mention that even for fellowships where there is a GPA range given, sometimes some competitions will say the average GPA of a Goldwater scholar is whatever. It's an average is one thing. It also isn't a cutoff. If there is a cutoff given, then that's usually real. So I think Rhodes has a 3.7 cutoff. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. So if you have a 3.65, Rhodes is not a good fit for you. But there are a lot of competitions. Truman is a great example where students will come to me and say, well, I don't have a 4.0. Can I still apply for Truman? And yes, you can of course apply for Truman without a 4.0 because there's no cutoff. What they want to see is that your GPA and your coursework align with your plans for the future. So if you have a 3.0, you can still apply for Truman. But if you have a 3.0 and you say you're going to Harvard Law, the Truman folks are going to be like, well, I don't know if you've really thought this through. So it's always important with fellowships, and I think with grad school as well, to make sure that what you have, what your GPA is, what your coursework is like, and what you're saying you want to do align with what you're applying for. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important thing to highlight, is like I was talking about in the personal statement about crafting this intellectual narrative. It's all about making who you are, where you're coming from, and where you're going legible to the committee. And I think, and again, like it's a challenging exercise, but I think that's something that really needs to come through is making your own thoughts and your own trajectory really legible to other people. So now we get to another really important component to both fellowships and applying to grad school is who should I ask for rec letters? Because rec letters are the bane of academia and fellowships, but they're required for literally everything. So who should you ask? This is probably one of the most common questions that I get when I talk to students. You can ask faculty members, you can ask research advisors, you can ask your internship directors, you can ask your deans, because there's so many deans here at Yale. And I know that many students are very close to your deans, and that's great. So the most important thing I think about rec letters and choosing rec letters for applying to grad school is how your recommenders fit together, what they all can say about you, and then who can say the strongest, most positive things about you. So I say that because some students I think are really tempted to ask the super famous professor who they took a lecture class with and who's known, globally, internationally, whatever. But if you don't know this famous professor on a personal level, and if they don't know you, they can't write you a strong recommendation letter. Like you're better off asking a junior faculty member who you've taken multiple seminars with, who can really speak to your ability to do research, can speak to your ability to be a student among other students in the classroom, can really speak to how you analyze things, and can say really specific things about you. And so I think that like that is usually the most important thing to keep in mind when you ask for rec letters. And then also think about who how your different professors or directors or whomever fits together in the broader scheme of what you're trying to say about yourself. So if one, again, this varies depending on your situation. But I have, I strategize with many students about like, well, how many people from this department should I ask? Or should I ask this person who can say these things about who I am as a person? And so like thinking about who you are as an academic, who you are as a person, and who you are as a researcher, again, like different people can say different things about you. And then you can throw in your internship directors or your job supervisor, and then it gets more complicated. So you just, again, really want to keep in mind what kind of narrative you're crafting about yourself and how each person that you're asking to write for you is contributing to that narrative. Generally, you need three, and asking the same people for faculty for recommendations is generally fine. For example, I have my core three people who write recommendation letters for me, and yet I always keep them updated about here's what I'm applying to, here are the deadlines, and will you be willing to write for me? And especially when you're applying to grad school, all of the dates are pretty much around the same time. But again, you want to make sure that your recommenders have these dates straight. So generally, I recommend reaching out to your advisors at least 2 months in advance. But typically, I think it's really great to get on their radar at the beginning of the fall semester. And so this is like in September, right? When everybody's back in campus, getting into the groove, and it's also letter writing season. So your faculty members are going to have lists of students that they need to write for and dates when those things are due. And so the sooner you can get on their radar, essentially, the better. They will also likely need reminders. So remind them about 3 weeks before the deadline is due. And this is totally fine. This is totally normal. As somebody on the other side, I really appreciate reminders. And just be like, hi, you agreed to write for me. Just wanted to let you know that the deadline is coming up, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if Lindsay wants to say a few words about how—
I have so many things to say about
okay.
recommendation letters.
Yes.
Now, this is all specific to fellowships, but everything that Emily said about thinking through who can say specific positive things about you is true for fellowships as well as for grad school. It's really important that they can write something more concrete than, oh yeah, this student took my class. Here's a paragraph about the class that I taught. I'm really great. This student got an A. Because that letter is not going to help you very much. If they can say, this student took my class, took this idea from the class and ran with it and did this other thing and showed initiative and showed teamwork and has this brilliant mind and etc. Great. That's a great letter. Now, you can't know what's going to be in the letter, which is very stressful. It's very stressful for students because you shouldn't know the actual content. You should know like, oh, this is going to be a good letter. You have to have enough of a relationship with your recommenders that you can trust them when you say, here's the thing that I'm pursuing. Do you think you could write a strong letter for me? And I always advise students to specify, can you write a strong letter? Because sure, anybody can write a letter. That's easy. I hereby recommend this person for this thing. The end. That's a letter is not a good one. So ask if they can write a strong letter. But even before that, you can think about how you're cultivating those relationships, not just as a transactional thing, not just as a, I need you to write for me eventually, and so I'm going to bring you a cup of coffee. Don't do that. Don't be that student. Be the student who says, I'm starting to think about grad school. Here's what I'm thinking about. What's your opinion? I really value your advice and perspective. I really admire this work you did on this thing. I hope to do something like this someday. What do you think? And if you start with those kinds of conversations, it gives you a chance to take their temperature. If they're like, oh no, you absolutely shouldn't go and get a master's degree in anthropology, then you know not to ask that person for a letter for the master's application in anthropology. So I guess my advice on this is to really think about building up to the letter. The letter is almost like a byproduct of a really valuable mentoring relationship or advising relationship where you can get all kinds of other important information from these folks. Always ask well in advance. For fellowships, it's also useful to find out, can I submit my application before the letters are turned in or not? I get a lot of panicked emails from students the day of the deadline because the recommendations are not in. And often it is the case for Yale deadlines that the recommendations can be submitted after the deadline has passed. They have to have been requested by the deadline, but the recommender can upload them. For national competitions, they have to be in by the deadline. And it's important to have that conversation with your recommenders so that they know, when is my deadline? Is it different from the deadline for you? And the final point I'm going to make about recommendations is that when you follow up with them about 3 weeks before the deadline, you should have a pretty solid draft of your statement or any other materials. And it's really helpful for them if you share it with them and give them kind of like a bullet point summary. Like, I've attached my personal statement. The main things that I think you can really speak to in your letter are this, this, and this. It's so helpful for them. Oh, and there's one other thing that I wanted to say. I said that was the final point. I'm sorry. The actual final point is you also have to trust them to say no if they're too busy. And if they say yes, you have to trust them. You can give them an out, but don't worry about asking them. It's a lot easier to revise a letter than to write a brand new one too. So in my letter writing experience, have always been happy to revise a letter that already exists for a student I've recommended for other things before. Turns out I have a lot to say about recommendations. We also have a whole page on our website about recommendations for fellowships.
No, that's super useful advice. And I just want to reiterate about making relationships, that the letter is really a product of the relationship that you have with a faculty member. And I think that's so true. And when I talk to students who are not seniors, sorry, seniors, I say that that's probably, again, one of the single most, that and research experience, like working, forming relationships with advisors and professors out of intellectual interests and commonalities is really the most important thing that you can do in your early years. Because yeah, it's just like you learn more from them as a scholar and as a human, and then it turns into an actual relationship that just extends. And for example, like I have known my undergrad advisor who's still on my dissertation committee for 10 years now. And and like, that's a really long time. I'm sure it'll just, become longer and longer. But I do think that those relationships are important. It's important to start thinking about them before the fall of your senior year. So yes, that was very useful things to think about when asking for recommendation letters. And then finally, we have some resources here that we wanted to highlight. Lindsay, I didn't know if you wanted to.
Yes, I can run through some of these. I am actually, I don't know how useful it's going to be to you all, but I want to make sure that you have this handout. We used to give paper copies of this to people in the olden days, in the before times. So this, I'm putting it in the chat, is a link to a PDF that shows kind of the top hits for postgraduate awards. They're organized by typical deadline month. So at the very top of that list is the Global Rhodes Scholarship. That one has a June deadline typically. So if you're thinking of applying for that, like, get on it, pick up the pace. June is right around the corner. You'll also see just a very brief summary there of the purpose of the award and the top eligibility requirements. So that's a nice kind of cheat sheet or beginning of your search for fellowships. And those are the competitions that we are most knowledgeable about in our office. So that's always useful. There are some URLs here as well for a list of external awards. It's kind of a bigger list. I don't even want to call it a database because it's just a filterable list. The external awards, when we say external, we mean competitions that are funded by someone outside of Yale. Some of those external awards have a Yale stage of the competition. So Yale nominates you, and then you go on to the national level. There's a page for graduate study in the UK and Ireland. It surprises me sometimes, as someone who also has come from a large public institution, how common it is for Yaleys to think about going abroad, going to the UK or Ireland for a master's program before they jump into a PhD. We have a whole bunch of information about that on our website, both how to find a program and how to get funding for it. And then I think it's the biggest on this page is how to make an appointment with a fellowships advisor. We have half-hour appointments available. We also have Friday afternoon, 15-minute slots if you don't feel like you need half an hour, but you just want to chat with somebody briefly about a question. Then, of course, always there's the student grants database. That's just studentgrants.yale.edu. And that database has all of the funding opportunities at Yale. So these are Yale funded awards. Those typically are not for graduate study. And the competitions with a Yale nomination process. So you'll find Fulbright there. You'll find Rhodes in there. Truman is in there. But generally speaking, the Yale Student Grants database is not going to be your first stop when you're looking for funding for graduate school. There's also, I linked to a page on the Fulbright website that is a list of grants that can support graduate study around the world. I love Fulbright, and I'll talk so much about it if you give me the chance. We have info sessions just about Fulbright coming up in the next couple of months. There's one on Friday even. You can also just send me an email if you're curious about Fulbright stuff, but if you're looking for funding for graduate study outside of the US and you are a US citizen, Fulbright is a great option. And then the final bullet point on this list, the UIC database, that's the University of Illinois at Chicago. They have a really, really deep database that lets you filter by all kinds of different things. And one of the things that they have there that we find really helpful when we talk with students who are not US citizens is a pretty extensive list of opportunities for international students and for undocumented students, because there are things out there for you as well. It's just not as obvious sometimes as some of the federally funded US citizen grants like Fulbright. So we're going to be able to, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think we're going to be able to send these slides around to the participants at this meeting. So we'll send you this and then you can click on all of those links yourself. But if you have questions about any of this, send me an email, and the next slide has my contact info on it. So.
Yeah, thank you. So in sum, this process is long. Set
Oh
yourself
no, it's
up.
5 o'clock already.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I know. And we've reached an hour. We're happy to take questions if you want to pop them in the question and answer chat or chat box if that's something that you want us to address for the crowd, or make appointments to meet with us individually. Again, Lindsay is our fellowship expert at the fellowships office, and they're fabulous. I send students to specifically the UK and Ireland page all the time. And again, I advise on humanities and social sciences, grad school, and Holly on STEM. And we would be happy to talk with you individually, and yeah, make appointments with us. And yeah, we just hope this has been useful. And again, we'll stay on for another couple of minutes if you want to ask a question in the chat box, in the question and answer function.
I don't see any questions coming in, Emily,
Okay.
do you?
I don't. Well.
And I see people are starting to leave.
Well, thank you all for joining
Thanks
us.
for coming.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.